been talking a lot on the programme about the planned unlocking for tomorrow, hearing about the risks, the balance of risks, and of course we'll be able to socialise indoors with up to 6 people. Should the changes tomorrow go ahead or should they be delayed?
Well, I've just been listening to the scientists on your show there, Sophie, and they seem very clear, don't they, that easing the restrictions tomorrow is the right thing to do. We needn't be alarmed enough yet to reconsider that, although the question about what happens in June remains. Now, the problem for me is, why has the road out of the lockdown become so much more uncertain than it looked just a few weeks ago? And the answer to that is the Prime Minister is not always following the science in the way that he ought to be doing. It was just a few weeks ago I was on your show and we were discussing the Prime Minister's plans to visit India to speak to the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. And as a result of that, Pakistan and Bangladesh had been put on the red list, but India had not. And it didn't go on the red list until three weeks after those other 2 countries, although the virus was running out of control in the whole of the subcontinent. Now, during that 3-week period, 20,000 passengers came back from India to the UK, and the Indian variant appears to have got into the country because of that. If the government was prioritising the protection of the borders, we may not even have this level of uncertainty. Now we have to deal with it. Now we're trying to understand whether this new variant is more contagious or not. But frankly, we shouldn't even be in this position if the government was protecting and securing the borders in the way that they ought to do.
I understand the debates about whether or not the government should have acted sooner to try and tackle the India variant on borders. But just want to go back to the question about what happens tomorrow, because you were saying that the scientists were quite clear. My sense is they're not totally clear on whether it should go ahead tomorrow. Mark Walport talking about the risks. Matt Hancock saying there's going to be a problem if actually it is 50% more transmissible if the unlocking goes ahead. We've got this sage advice, of course, saying that if the India variant is up to 50% more transmissible, then that actually could lead, the unlocking tomorrow could actually lead to a resurgence in cases and hospitalisations that equals or even exceeds the previous peaks. So is the science really clear? I'm not sure it is.
Well, we don't know the answer to some of the questions you're posing there, Sophie. And the India variant seems to be more prevalent in certain parts of the country at the moment than elsewhere. And this is always going to be a balance of risks, isn't it? The risk of keeping the lockdown longer and all of the damage that that's doing to the economy and lives and livelihoods, and the risks in opening up. Now, we're in a slightly riskier situation than we should have been because of missteps the government's taken over protecting the borders. But I think right now, the judgment to take is that we should go ahead with the lockdown, easing of the lockdown tomorrow, keep a very close eye on what developments are so that we can review whether the planned opening later in June is the right thing to do. But short term, we need to make sure that the measures are in place to contain the variant or the virus in those areas where it seems to be gaining more of a foothold. And that means looking at contact tracing and making that work far better than it has previously. People who have been self-isolating at home, we understand only 3 in 100 have been contacted. That's not acceptable. That system has to work far better than that. And the other core issue that I also heard your previous guest refer to, excuse me, is self-isolation payments. If people are afraid they will lose income by self-isolating because they're on low pay or insecure work, then we run the risk that they won't be able to afford to do it, and therefore people will be moving around in society and potentially transmitting the virus. We have to fix self-isolation payments and we have to get contact tracing working far better than currently if we're going to keep a grip on this variant, whether it's more contagious or not.
OK, so Labour's position that tomorrow's unlocking should go ahead, the one in June should be kept under review. If the data suggests that actually the transmissibility is what some of the scientists fear, then should we be prepared to reverse the changes coming in tomorrow?
We always have to be prepared to do that, don't we? If the science tells us that the situation is no longer safe and we're heading towards another more serious and prolonged lockdown, then we're in trouble. Now, previous decisions that the government, dodged really, like the circuit breaker that SAGE was recommending to the government back in September, October last year. Because the government didn't do that, we ended up with a much higher rate of infections over Christmas and into the new year, and a rate of deaths that really could have been avoided had the government acted earlier. None of us want to be in that position again. So if the science is telling us that this variant is more infectious than it may well be at the moment, then of course that must always be kept under review, because that's the way that we prevent a more severe and prolonged lockdown later in the year.
Should we be prepared to impose restrictions regionally or locally in hotspot areas, or should we always be looking for a national picture?
Well, I mean, my view is the regional tiers didn't really work very well last time. They very quickly broke down because people move around. I think the lesson from that for me is it's best if we move together. If we move together as one country. But there are things the government should be doing in the meantime. And I think particularly what I was saying about contact tracing, self-isolation payments, those are there. If you talk to local leaders, regional mayors, council leaders, public health directors, they tell you that these are the things the government needs to focus on. They have not been working well enough up until now. It's urgent that the government fixes them if we're going to contain the virus without running the risk of a longer and more prolonged lockdown.
How are you going to act tomorrow? Mark Walport told me that we should be hugging cautiously. Matt Hancock said he's going to be hugging people outside. What's your policy?
We need people to behave with as much restraint as they can. I'll be going into Parliament tomorrow, so I suspect I won't be hugging very many people at all. But I think we can trust the good judgment of people. We know this variant is out there. We know this thing isn't over yet. The British people have behaved with extraordinary self-restraint over recent months. All of us are desperate to get out there and get back to our lives as they used to be. But we have a little further to go until we're at that point, unfortunately.
Sorry to hear that if you're kind of being cautious over your hugging, there's not many parliamentarians that are going to make the cut there. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Labour. It's been a difficult few weeks for the Labour Party, I'm sure you'll admit. A lot of criticism that people just don't know what Labour under Keir Starmer stands for. And it feels as if the Conservative Party messaging is kind of drilled into all of our brains: get Brexit done, levelling up, building back better. And if I'm being honest, I was trying to remember what Labour's slogan was going into May's elections, and I actually couldn't remember it. What was it?
Secure the economy and protect the NHS was the core of the messaging that we were going into those elections with. But the point you make is right. Since the election earthquake for us of December 2019, Labour's clearly had an electoral mountain to climb. No one's made any bones about that. I haven't. Sir Keir Starmer certainly hasn't. And in between Keir being elected just over a year ago and the elections we just had, we've had the lockdown. So as leader of the Labour Party, Keir has still not been able to get out there and shake a real voter's hand or give a speech in front of a live audience. And with the country necessarily and understandably focused on the crisis and how we get out of it, it's been very difficult to find the space to start talking about a forward offer from the Labour Party. I mean, despite all of that, despite the huge disappointment of the Hartlepool result, if you look at the results across the whole country, they were much more mixed than they looked the morning after Hartlepool. We were picking up council seats in Sussex, in Hertfordshire. We won 11 of the 13 mayoral elections across the country.
So it was a good set of elections for you, was it then?
It was mixed. I'm not going to pretend it was good.
Mixed?
I absolutely admit we've got a mountain to climb, but it was a bit more mixed. And if we have a mountain to climb, which is how we've described it since the general election in 2019, then last week we had halved the Tory lead compared to the general election. That's progress, but it's not enough because we need to overhaul the Conservatives if we're going to win the next general election. But that was never going to be done in 1 year. No one ever pretended it could be done in a single year. And particularly given the circumstances of the pandemic, it's been very difficult for a party to come out and project a set of proposals for the future as we come out of the lockdown, as politics starts to normalise and we face the future again without the domination of the pandemic in all of our minds, that is when Labour can start to make its future offer to the country. And the Shadow Chancellor, the newly appointed Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has already started doing that this week, talking about work, talking about the family, talking about the importance of place and community to people. We will start to flesh out a series of proposals around that, and we'll do it by talking to, reconnecting with and listening to the country so that the Labour Party's priorities reflect the concerns and priorities of the British people, perhaps in a way that they haven't done in recent years.
Just got to be careful talking about work. That's Angela Rayner's brief, isn't it?
The agenda that we will be developing will be for the whole of the Labour Party to talk about together.
Okay.
And Angela's a close friend of mine. She's a fantastic communicator. She's got a big role to play in all of this, of course.
Okay. I take your point about the difficulties projecting your offer during a pandemic. But the issue that people have is, have you actually got an offer to project? You know, secure our economy, protect our NHS, the Conservatives could say exactly that thing. It feels that people don't actually know what the big vision is. I mean, you're all close to Keir Starmer. What is it? What is the big vision, the revolution that many people want?
I genuinely don't think it's right for me to just sit here and describe to you what the outcome of a process of engagement with the British people over the next few months is going to be. If it's a genuine engagement, then we have to be out there and listening. But if we just
You've been doing that for 18 months. You've been doing that for 18 months. You haven't just suddenly, Keir Starmer hasn't just suddenly come into power. Some people would say that what I'm asking you for, I'm giving you a platform to speak to our viewers, to speak to people of the UK about what the big vision is, and you've actually ducked it. Isn't that exactly the issue?
Well, let's take work. Let's take work as one issue. We know that one of the problems is that there have not been enough good, new, secure jobs in every single part of the country, so that every place, every town, every city, every county can be the best place to grow up, the best place to grow old, and the best place to live and to work. That investment hasn't been coming in. So we've seen the good old manufacturing jobs replaced by low-paid, insecure jobs in the gig economy, and that isn't what people need to see. Now, we have to work out how we are going to work with the different regions to bring in the investments to sustain the good jobs of the future that can give everybody the security they need, that they can get a job in their locality that is going to see them and their families through the future. Now, one of the key ways of doing that is through devolution. It's through opening up power so all the decisions aren't taken in Whitehall, but many more decisions taken in localities by people who understand how their localities work better. Now, the government has been trailing for the last 2 years a devolution bill that was set out their proposals for that. We got the Queen's speech just last week. No sign of the devolution bill. They've dropped it. And the reason I think they've dropped it is because Labour won 11 of the 13 Metro mayoral elections. The Conservatives are frightened that when people see Labour in power, they like it, so they've dropped their plans for devolution. That is one of the key ways that we get the investment in and the infrastructure in to bring in the good jobs of the future, and the Conservatives are refusing to do it. So there's one area where I think Labour can start to hammer them very, very hard as we emerge from the pandemic.